I hope you all can hear me. Yes? Okay, thank you. And I'd like to thank the staff here at the Glendale Public Library for making this all happen. So this is incredible. I think we should give them a hand as well. Yes. Without librarians, where would our society be? You know? So here to all librarians. So I'm Denise McIver, and I wanted to welcome all of our audience members who are part of this experiment tonight, both in person and the hybrid online. I'm looking very forward to the conversation. And because I have New York in my psychic DNA, I love New York history. So this book totally captured me from page 2. Seriously. And there were moments where I followed this young, smart, creative, ambitious Black woman, or as she would tell you, she was known as being colored. And you have to remember that most of the action in this book happens at the turn 1905. So it's barely after the turn of the 20th century, and things were very different. I'm delighted that Dr. Erickson is here. I'm delighted and so proud of the two authors for working in tandem on this project, and it's a marvelous project. I congratulate you on all your successes. So bravo to that. Okay, I'd like to do a little historical perspective. So the first question I have listed here is, how did you two come upon the life story of Belle DeCosta Green in the first? How did this story come to you? Or how did you come to it?
How did we come to Belle? And I just want to apologize in advance for my voice. I am not well tonight, so I'm gonna do my best to be heard and articulate, and I just apologize. It's not great. So actually, Victoria and I have talked about this many times. Is it okay if I start off, Victoria?
Oh, sure, or else I'll speak for you whenever you can't speak. I got you.
Excuse me. So for many years before I started writing historical fiction, I was a commercial litigator in New York City, and I knew it was not my calling. I knew I was meant to kind of harken back to my original passion, which was unearthing the marginalized voices of history. And I used to sneak out during my long work days and visit cultural institutions like the Morgan Library. That was one of my favorite haunts. And when one day I happened to be there, and for the people who have never been to the Morgan Library, it is like a gorgeous, stunning jewel box of a library, crimson and gold, and beautiful bibliographical treasures like the Gutenberg Bible and Renaissance art. And I could really transport myself to a different place and a different life when I was there. And one day, this was many decades ago, I happened to run into a docent at the end of one of her tours. And we got to talking, and she mentioned to me that even though the library was the Morgan Library, and that it was started and funded, created by J.P. Morgan, the famous financier and industrialist, it actually hadn't been created just by him alone, that there was actually a woman involved, and she named Belle DeCosta Green. And I hadn't started writing books at that time, but I was collecting ideas, and I added Belle to the list of names of women that I was curious about. I thought it was remarkable that a woman at this time period, early 1900s, before women had the right to vote, that she was actually not just the head of the Morgan Library, but she was a huge force in the art world. She was really revolutionary in her collecting and her negotiation tactics and her presence, her very self. She was a celebrity in her own right, in addition to being this art force. And over the years, as I turned to writing, I would kind of dip into the research about her from time to time. And as the years progressed, her real identity became known. And I realized that she was so much more remarkable than I could have ever imagined, because she was actually a Black woman passing as white at a time of extreme prejudice and segregation in our country, a time period when she probably wouldn't have been really welcomed to tour the Morgan Library. She was running the institution. And she came from this amazing background of Richard T. Greener, her father, famous supporter of equality, first Black graduate of Harvard, and her mother, who came from this multi-generational free community of color in Washington, D.C. So she just became more remarkable the more that was learned about her over the years. And I knew that I wanted to tell her story, but I also knew as a fiction writer, I can envision many, many things, but I cannot imagine what it's like to be a Black woman in our country. I have no ability to do that, no right to do that. And I also knew that because Belle had spent so many years hiding her real identity, she deserved to have a Black woman tell her story as well. And when it was right around that time that I was thinking really hard about it, that I read one of Victoria's books that you mentioned, or that someone mentioned, Stand Your Ground, which was, it's a magnificent book. I highly recommend. It's a look at this terrible issue in our country of the shooting of young Black men. And Victoria looked at the perspective fresh and new through the eyes of the women. And I just felt as though, wow, I wonder if she would be willing to embark on this project with me. I didn't know her. So I took the bold move of reaching out to her through our agents. And I'll let her take it from there.
And that's how we got started. We got started together. Marie sent me a proposal, I guess. It was a 3-page synopsis of the story, but it took me about 2, maybe 3 months to read it because the first page was about JP Morgan, and I was not interested in JP Morgan at all. And so I couldn't get past the first page. But once I finally read it, I couldn't wait to get together with Marie and write this. And like she said, we did not know each other, but it took us about 5 minutes to feel like we were good friends. And by the time we finished the first draft, we were sisters.
Wow. Another question I'd like to ask is how, I know how, excuse me, it works in certain contexts. Like if you're working on a comedy show, in the writer's room, there are 6 or 7 writers flinging jokes and trying to put together a script. How is it to have co-authors writing a historical narrative, a fictionalized version?
Well, I had actually collaborated with another author. I'd written about 6 books with another author, Rashonda Tate Billingsley. Marie had never written with anyone before. And Marie is very much, I'm talking about her like she's not here, but she's very much.
Go right ahead.
she's very much an attorney, flow charts and timelines and things like that. I'm totally opposite. Like they give us a deadline. I'm like, that's just a suggestion. They don't really need us to turn in that day, And so we're the opposite. But one of the things that I was able to get Marie to do, and she's gotten me much more focused on these deadlines, was that to understand that there's no way to do this. It depends on the story. It depends on your strengths. And our strengths, we're like, Marie always says, we fit together like this, like a hand and glove. Because the things she hates, I love, and the things that she loves, I hate. And so we put this together. So a lot of people say that in The Personal Librarian, they can't believe that 2 people wrote that book because it seems seamless. Right. And the reason for that is because we wrote every word together. What we did was we discussed every chapter ahead of time. Like if we had been smart, we would have recorded those talks, but we discussed every chapter. We would talk about 4 or 5 chapters at a time, down to what do you think they said? What do you think they wore? Oh, you know what? We should put this in there. Just talking. And then when we finished after hours every day, we would then, depending on what the chapter was, one of us would say, I'll write that one. or Marie would say, I would write that one. And whoever wrote it just really wrote the foundation, because then we'd write it and then we'd switch. We'd send it to the other one to put in their things. And so that's why it's one voice, because Belle was one person that she spoke to both of us equally. And the same way that Marie said that she didn't want this story to happen without a Black author, a Black voice, it wouldn't have been possible to do this story any justice without a white author and a white voice, because she lived as a white woman, even though at night, when she went home and put her head down, she knew who she was.
Thank you. What resources did you use while researching this book? It's my understanding that she burned, before her passing, most of her personal correspondence. And I think it's my understanding also that she kept most of I guess this is for archival purposes, for the birth of the library and moving forward, much of her business correspondence. Do you know if she kept journals? I'm just curious because and I've read that, like I said, that she actually burned some of her personal materials.
In terms of, I'll start off if that's okay, Victoria. In terms of Belle's personal correspondence, you're exactly right that at the end of her life, she burned all of her letters, and she asked the other people in her life to do the same. The only thing that escaped that bonfire were the letters that she sent to Bernard Berenson. Bernard Berenson, for people who haven't read the book or aren't familiar with him, he was a world-renowned Renaissance expert. Really, he's been described as the person who really kind of rebirthed the Renaissance artwork. He gave it, and it kind of fallen by the wayside, and he explained it to people, gave it new life, really brought the artists to people's attentions. And he was very well known in the circles that Belle traveled. They met professionally, and then they formed a relationship that was more than professional. But it was a relationship, despite what Victoria and I wrote, it is a relationship that lasted for many, many decades throughout her life and changed over time. She wrote to Bernard as if it was a journal. It was almost like writing to Bernard was her journal. From what I understand, she would almost like keep a letter open and write, oh, this is what happened today. And then she turned it over and do the next day, which frustrated him to no end because he was an ardent letter writer. He would write every day without fail, especially when they were in a kind of a hot and heavy part of the relationship. I was slated to go to Italy. The letters, those letters, the Bernard Berenson, Belle de Costa Green letters, were in Itati, which I think that's how you pronounce it. It's the villa that he lived in out in, I think it's in Tuscany. When he died, he donated it to Harvard. And at some point in that history, those letters were found, those letters were discovered. I doubt that people really understood the importance of those letters at first, because I don't think the light had really been shown super brightly on Belle. I was scheduled to go to look at the letters myself. They had not been digitized or available other than in person. And then COVID happened and I couldn't go. We had to rely on a wonderful book in terms of those personal letters by Heidi Artizoni. It's called An Illuminated Life, in which she excerpts and recaps and really gives her own sort of summarization of a lot of those letters. That's not how I normally like to do things, but the circumstances were such that that's what we were forced to do. But that is just part of the research that we did. There was research into, oh gosh, Gilded Age, the Gilded Age world, J.P. Morgan, his family, the art world, in Canubula, if I'm pronouncing that right, early printed artwork, Caxtons, Gutenbergs, illustrated manuscripts, Bohemian, also,
then the Bohemian lifestyle, because she had that. What did she wear to the Vanderbilt's ball?
Right.
Did they have music there? I mean, everything you have to research.
Yeah.
And you're not writing a contemporary novel. You have to research how did they travel around the city.
Right.
It drove me nuts when she was getting together with her friends and she couldn't call them on a cell phone. That drove me nuts because I'm like, what? How do you get together with your friends and suppose they don't show up? So we had to do all of that, which I just love. And one of the things I love about research, because a lot of people think that you research everything first and then you sit down and you just write it. And I love what Marie says. She says, we research as much as we can. We both read that novel. And she said, once you have it all in your head, forget it.
Right.
And then you start writing. But what I love about it is that you don't know what you don't know until you don't know it. And so when we're writing the Vanderbilt's Ball, I'm like, well, who's there? Like, and what does it look like? And we found floor plans of the ships that she went from the United States over to London. It's wonderful. The research is what I love about historical fiction.
You better love it, because you're going to be knee deep in it for a long time, whether it's the macro, developments, the historical movements, social, cultural, political, military, or it's micro stuff, like what are they wearing? What are they eating? And, those are the things that really bring a character alive, and it becomes an engaging story rather than a nonfiction text.
Dr. Erickson has joined us tonight from the Morgan Library, and I would like him to talk about her archives that are there, and also about, is it 2024 that the exhibit will be scheduled to open? So Dr. Erickson, would you be kind enough?
Yeah, no problem. So I'll say at the outset that this book was really special to me because I started my appointment as the new Astor Curator of Printed Books and Bindings. It's the department which I head. And so when you see all those books in the beautiful East Room, those are now my charge. And I read The Personal Librarian right before I started my position. I had already been, pretty immersed in Heidi Artazona's work. And so I like the interpretation, the sort of narrative aspect. Of course, the biography does have quite a bit of that kind of speculative narrative element to it, but this did something different. This spoke to me on a personal level as somebody who's working in a field that has been historically exclusive, and so it was somewhat cathartic on that level. And I related with your interpretation of the character Belle as sort of a larger than life figure very, very closely. But then coming into the position and being at the Morgan, being immersed at the Morgan every day, day in, day out, spending numerous hours in the vaults, going through the collections, Belle's presence looms large there. You'll see little notes in the collections, commentary about her acquisitions, commentary about really erudite commentary about particular editions, incunables or manuscript or block books. She seems to have a vast wealth of knowledge about the various collecting areas of the Morgan strengths. One thing that comes out in her archival presence is that her professional life was so important to her. Right. And I think that's an aspect of the story that is going to be foregrounded in the exhibition. And the exhibition is scheduled to be released in 2024, which is a celebration of the centenary of the opening of the Morgan as a public institution. It was J.P. Morgan Jr., along with Belle DaCosta Green, who opened it up to the public. J.P. Morgan, the father, founded the library with Belle DaCosta Green, but it was really his son that made it a public institution. So this is an aspect of the story that's really going to come to the surface.
Oh, I'm so happy.
That's amazing. I think, Dr. Erickson, that Jack, I think Jack was the son's name, trusted her enough and her acumen as not only a scholar, she was most definitely to me a self-taught in a way, but she was definitely a scholar so that she could talk to anyone. When she went to London for that auction to buy that huge, was it the Holt collection? I forget the name of the seller.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Axon. Yeah. So I thought she could hold her own in any environment. And she definitely showed that at the Vanderbilt's ball and the Woolworth ball and the other places where she socialized. But then I also felt that there was a tension within her internally, like when she's at that, I think it was the red party where they had everything was red from clothing to food, that she saw a Black butler. And I'm not sure if that's the right party, but she makes eye contact with him. And there was almost a primal urge within her to have a word or a few words with him, but she remembered where she was and how it would have, because nobody at that party would have talked to a Black butler.
Yeah.
And she couldn't, she had to hold herself back. And that must have been so painful for her that she could not emotionally, in that instant, reach out to that butler and just acknowledge him. I mean, she did catch his eye. And I think she said thank you when he gave her additional champagne or something.
You know, that was an interesting thing that Marie and I talked about the whole time, because we don't know how Belle felt about being Black or about passing. We don't have anything to know, but we could extrapolate from what we do know about her. And we do know who her father was and his pride in his race. And we do know who her mother was and her family's pride in their race. And so there would be no reason for her to just say, I don't want to be Black. We really believe what we wrote, even though it's fiction and it's our interpretation of Belle. We really believe that her mother, because it came from her mother. A lot of people say, well, why didn't Belle do this or why didn't Belle do that? She was a young adult, a young woman in her teens when this happened. And so she had to follow her mother. And at any point, if she wanted to say, okay, I'm a Black now, she would have had to give up her mother and her siblings. And who's going to do that? So we don't know. And we extrapolated that she came from this very proud background. So she wanted to pass, not to be white. She wanted to pass to be equal. Mm-hmm. And if she had that mindset, she was always very aware of the fact that she was Black. And she went home every night and put her head down on the pillow and she knew she was Black. And when she got up in the morning and had to do her hair, she knew she was Black. She used more hairpins than anybody trying to hide it. So we know, and I can imagine what it was like for her to see a Black person and wanting to say hello, but you cannot do that.
Yes, it was verboten. The races did not mix. Can we talk a little bit about the Gilded Age or the lead up? Because a lot of people are not aware of this time period, but it produced more, they call Fifth Avenue still to this day, Millionaires Row, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about the social context and the culture of that time, please? What it was like for moneyed people, most of whom were white, of course, yes.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And what was it like? And then there's everybody else. It's sort of like today.
Yeah, I mean, when we
I
think
hate to admit, as much as I hate to admit that, but
when
can you
we
talk a little
think
bit
about
about the culture of the Gilded Age?
Yeah, when we think about the Gilded Age, we think about the things you're mentioning, right? We think about the sumptuous brownstones or the Vanderbilt mansion, some of which don't still exist, but some of which do. We think about, the opulent interiors. We think about the wealth of Newport. Some of their second homes were there or on the Gold Coast and Long Island. We think about extreme wealth because there was really, I don't want to say for the first time, but in some ways, it really was the first time that there was this massive wealth. Prior to the Gilded Age, there was, at least in New York, a sort of an echelon called the Knickerbockers, which were this Dutch, not all, but a lot of Dutch descendants who had Dutch ancestry, who had been in this country for a long time and had money, but didn't have Andrew Carnegie money, didn't have Frick money, didn't have even JP Morgan money. Now, to be fair, JP Morgan would have been considered not one of the most lavish, even though he was extremely wealthy and he had this gorgeous library. There definitely were people who were living more lavish, more he would consider garish lifestyle. So when we think about the Gilded Age, that's what we think about. But one of the things that was important to Victoria and I is to talk about the other part of the Gilded Age, because the Gilded Age came on the heels of the Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1865. Immediately thereafter, we had Reconstruction and a period of time when there was hope for equality, hope. And there was some progress. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1875. We had, for example, Richard T. Greener benefited from that hope. He was the first Black professor at the University of South Carolina in a time period when it went from segregation to integration. But as the years went on, not too many years, that hope started to be peeled away and white supremacy started to raise up, and segregation and Jim Crow started to raise up, some in practice, some in actual legislation. And that's the underbelly of the Gilded Age. When we think about, the Gilded Age, we think about the balls and the Vanderbilts and we think about the mansions, but we don't think about how those parties happened and who was serving in those homes, whether they were immigrants who were living in incredibly impoverished conditions, or whether they were formerly enslaved people who had been free, but who by no means were equal. And as the years progressing, we're going to become less and less so. So, I think it was important for us to show both sides of that time period to kind of, and Belle operated in both, she really did.
Which is pretty amazing in and of itself.
Very
Yes.
rare.
I'm also thinking that because of Jim Crow and segregation in the South, this was probably the dripping of the Great Migration of people moving to
Yeah.
Harlem,
Yeah.
to Chicago, and
Yeah.
eventually to Los Angeles. If you've
Yeah.
read The Warmth of
Yeah.
Other Suns by Isabel
Yeah.
Wilkerson,
Yeah.
which is a great detailed study of the Great Migration. I think something like 3 million Black people moved from the southern states of the
Yeah.
United States up where they believed they could go to a city where they would not experience the Jim Crow racism, but they found racism just not the same. It was less in your face, but they still had to deal with racist behavior of the other people, and they had to struggle. So that was, it was an important time in Black history. So moving on, Belle started working for JP Morgan shortly. She was in her early 20s. I think she was about 21, maybe 22.
Well, she did what a lot of women do
Yeah.
today. That's what she told people.
Right.
She was a bit older, we believe.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it. I think Dr. Erickson might know better, but I think she used to say that she was born in 1883, but I think she was probably more likely born in 1879, which would have made her closer to, mid to late 20s when she started. But then as now, there was ageism. So
Yeah.
she wanted to be as young as she could.
Age was just a number.
Yeah, for Belle.
Well, I asked that because she did not have extensive experience as what we call a special librarian. Jesse, when I was in library school, we had academic librarians, law librarians, of course, your public librarians, but there's a special class of librarians who work. I work for an art museum. Jesse is an MLIS graduate working for a public research, but it was private until it changed over to being public in 1924. So I guess my question is, she had maybe 2 years of experience in the academic library at Princeton. What was it about her, and I was fascinated, that actually forced or caused JP Morgan to hire her? And he mentions the fact early on in the book that you don't have a lot of experience, but she was determined.
Yeah.
So I wondered if he sensed her force of will. I wonder if he saw a comrade, an ally in her. Like your take on it.
Yeah. Do you want to go, Victoria? Do you
Yeah,
want me?
I think it was all of the above.
Yeah.
I think she was this young woman, he didn't matter. I think he found her attractive. And so he was like, oh, this is another piece of art I can have in here. I think he found her smart. I think he was curious because she came recommended by his nephew. I think he could see her moxie, her confidence. I think it was all of the above, which ended up being really what their relationship was about. It was everything. He was her mentor. She was his protege. She was his confidant. And she confided in him as well. And, there's speculation of if they've ever had a relationship, though Marie and I spent months talking about that and decided, no, based on what we know about them, she was too smart for that. So I
It was
think
too easy too. It would have been almost expected. Though there were, I think he was actually nicer to her than he was to his own children.
He was, sure.
I think
he didn't have a lot of patience for Anne, his daughter, but he also did not share her politics. So
yeah, that could mess it up. But I just think it was all of the above with Belle. I think, and I think curiosity had a lot to do with it in the beginning, and then she got in there and she worked hard, and he liked that.
I think too, the idea, as Victoria said, that into this very white male, these enclaves, auction houses, parties, where she would be finding pieces to collect. Part of that was networking and knowing the right people. Museums. I mean, she was very, very often the only woman in the room. And I think there was part of him that loved the idea of this petite, attractive powerhouse walking into these rooms, unsettling everything. There was something very attractive about that. And she used all of that to her advantage. I'm sure there were moments when she was nervous, but she never let it show. And that moxie and those sort of rare negotiating practices really got her far. But I do want to say something about the library sciences. And again, maybe Dr. Erickson would weigh in on this more. But, at this time period, it's my understanding that there wasn't a specific training in library sciences as there is today. It wasn't as formalized. It was just starting out. And a lot of it was like apprenticeship type work. You would kind of work under the tutelage of somebody who was well known in an area. And I do think that Belle, she really liked the rare manuscripts. She really liked those early printed books. And they had there were some experts at Princeton. And of course, Junius had donated a bunch of books, a bunch of Virgils, and I think he had some Caxtons as well. And he, she took every opportunity to learn everything that she could about those books. And then, of course, she had that special relationship with Junia. So I don't think it would have been as glaring as it would be today that she didn't have all these credentials. The fact that she came from Princeton, that she had worked under well-known people, that Junius recommended her. But that said, she was up against, my understanding, some pretty fierce competition for the job. I think there was a curator from the Met who was considered for the job as well. So there was something special about Belle.
I have
Yeah.
two more questions because I think we're going to move on to the Q&A, both
If
the
I
chat
may,
as well as live here. And there's a microphone standing for those of you who would like to pose questions to the co-authors.
I don't think I heard you.
I didn't hear you.
Oh, I thought Dr. Erickson.
Yeah.
oh, yes. My name was invoked, so yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add really quickly a couple of points on that. Sidney Cockerell, who was another really well-known curator of note and former Kelmscott secretary, in conversation with Philip Hofer, described Belle as one of the most intelligent women he had ever known. And he wasn't being facetious, but he said it in a response that basically described her as someone who knew how to get into all the right sources, right? And to learn everything one needs to learn about a particular topic when they need to learn it. And what I would say about libraries is that, yes, certainly by the end of the 19th century, it was being professionalized.
Okay.
The librarianship as a field was being professionalized, and library education was being professionalized. And we have to remember that, she retires by the middle of the 20th century. We're at 1948, shortly before, she passes. And so she would have seen during that time, the whole arc of that professionalization come to its fruition, right? And so, it wasn't necessarily in the cards that she would have been able to rely on just her connections alone. So there was something about her savvy and her intellect. And you have to remember that her father was interested also in rare books. Her father had a background in rare books as well.
Yes.
So she had the opportunity to study art history and the history of and interact and engage with the idea of rare books, in theory from a pretty young age. So I think that combination of all those things together really sets her up for success when she walks into that interview.
Well, she was very driven. We can tell that she taught herself Latin, Greek, and French, and she was fluent in French.
Yeah. She was driven, encouraged by her mother, we believe, who I think she was just like a lot of Black mothers who say you have to be 3 times better just to be considered equal. So get out there and do it.
And do it. Get your foot in the door any way you know how. And then she ran with it, clearly. And he trusted her.
Did he ever?
Explicitly, implicitly. I think we have time for one more question. What would you like your readers? And I know it sold many, many copies, and I know you must have heard back from readers. What would you ultimately like your readers to glean from this narrative, from this story?
One of the things that was important to me in writing this novel is that in the African-American community, passing is looked down upon. And one of the things that it was very important for Marie and I, Marie kept saying, I want us to show the sacrifices and the struggle. And because in the African-American community, sometimes it's believed that people pass because they want to be white. And I think we gave people an opportunity to understand passing from a different perspective.
Mm.
And I think we accomplished that because there's a lot of people that said we changed their minds and they understand it. And they understand that people were just using whatever advantage they had, just like Black people use whatever advantages they have in today's times. So that was one of the most important things to me because I remember, I can't remember who it was, but someone was interviewing us and she said that she almost didn't want to read it. Do you remember who this was?
Karen Grigsby Bates.
Yes,
Oh,
yes, on
Good
NPR.
friend.
I couldn't remember who it was. And she's like,
Yeah.
she almost didn't want to read it because it was another book about passing. And she just didn't like people who passed.
Mhm.
And this book changed her mind. This book gave her a different perspective. And to give it to her, to give her a different one, I think we accomplished our goal.
That was huge. I think for me too, this is what I do and what I've been doing for a long time is write historical fiction about women who've left important legacies, but whose stories aren't known, so that we can shift the lens on the way that we look at the past and see these women where they've been all along, hiding in plain sight, and start to really give them their just due. The fact that the ability to do that with a Black woman, and then really there are, when you look at our society, who is more marginalized than the Black community, to give a voice and to put back into the narrative this powerful, incredible Black woman who was there all along. People didn't realize it, and to shift the way that people look at not just the Morgan, but look at that time period and start to see her where she was and where so many other Black women are. Nothing is more, I don't know, rewarding. I don't know if that's the right word. It's such an honor when Victoria and I get lots and lots of pictures of people who take their personal librarian to the Morgan Library and take pictures of themselves there with that book. And it just makes me feel as though they're seeing Belle where she was, inhabiting those hallways, building up that collection. And that to me is like, oh my gosh, we really did do it. We really put her back in the narrative in a very, obviously Heidi Artizzoni had done that, and the Morgan has talked about Belle for a long time, but it really brought her alive in a very meaningful way for a lot of people. And that really meant the world. That was a huge honor to be part of that process.
I was in the Morgan Library visiting Dr. Erickson last month, and just to see the space, the physical space of where she had her office,
Mhm.
it
We
was
love it.
like a mini, my God, it looked like an intellectual playground. I mean, the Gutenberg's out there. She has these phenomenal books lining the entire space. It looked like a perfect square. Maybe I'm wrong, Jesse, but it was perfectly calibrated to me. And to know that she was directly across the hall from JP Morgan,
Yeah.
and he could yell for her
He
to
could just
come in.
yell.
We did.
So I love that. Belle! And
Yeah.
sometimes they would play cards together. So I like the fact that he was in close proximity, but I also like the fact that she had her own universe.
Mhm. Yeah. We love it too.
And it was quite impressive to me. And as a Black librarian, I'm very proud of her accomplishments, her achievements on behalf of Mr. Morgan. And she was the first director. She also hired a lot of women in her wake, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah,
And
I
one of the
think
things that I was amazed by when I was at the library was that check for $80,000. I don't remember what year it was cut for her. But Jesse, I was amazed that she was making that kind of money, probably in the late 30s? Or maybe earlier.
Oh,
He was
yeah.
very generous to her too.
Yeah,
was-
even earlier.
Even earlier, yes. And she was generous to the women who came up. She trained women. She was an early feminist in some ways.
Yeah, she wouldn't have called herself that, but she
No,
certainly
but
was.
she also hung out with suffragists,
Yeah. Mhm.
Mhm.
learned how to drink cocktails in bohemian
beer.
bars in the
Yeah,
West
she learned how to
Village.
drink dark beer down in those
Yes.
bars.
Yeah, she did.
So she was her own butterfly, but she was very much serious about her work with Mr. Morgan.
Oh,
She could
absolutely.
hang with the best of them. That's
Yeah.
what I learned. You have to be able to be in whatever room.
Whatever room.
Mhm.
Yeah. I always say that she was an uptown girl and a downtown girl. She could
She
hang
was
uptown
both. Yes.
with the Vanderbilts, and then she could hang out Saturday night down in the village.
Down in the village, yes, the West Village. So, Jesse, would you like to add any additional thoughts?
I'll just note that, Marie, you mentioned your plans to go down to Itati, and those plans, coming to a halt because of the pandemic. Well, the Morgan has been in working in collaboration with Harvard and Itati to digitize those letters
Mhm.
and make them available through Harvard and Itati. There's just a rich archive there in those letters because they cover a lot of topics. Similarly, her professional correspondence, right, at the Morgan, does shed some light into some aspects of her personality. So, it's hard to cleanly divide her professional life from her personal life and the correspondence there. So, those transcriptions hopefully will be available, late 2022 or perhaps early next year. They're going to shed light on a lot of various aspects of early to mid 20th century professional work and bibliographic history and the art scene and art history and all the sort of minutiae and machinations involved in that world. So we're really excited about that.
So crazy excited. You've no idea. I'm so excited
Yeah.
about that. And I'm so just thrilled with, we only know what we've been told by people at the Morgan, but we're so excited about what you guys have planned for 2024 for the celebration, for your 100-year celebration of the institution becoming public. It's just really thrilling. I can't wait.
Oh,
We
and
should
really
all
quickly,
go.
we have Bookman's Paradise.
When does it open, Jesse?
2024. I'm not sure the exact date.
Okay.
But it will be part of the centenary. And we have Bookman's Paradise open right now, which covers the history of the Morgan as a space, the architecture, and some of our, the greatest books in our collection are featured. And also some of that professional history comes out there. And there's a section on Belle de Costa Green. And so it looks fantastic. We just had our opening this evening. I just got home from it, and for anybody that's in the New York area or visiting, come by and see the show.
Thank you.
It's right outside of Midtown Manhattan, and it's a nice walk from Grand Central or wherever you're coming from. I think we have some guests, audience members, who might have questions for our panel. Would you like to introduce yourself and then ask your question, please?
I'm from Pasadena. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Right up the street from the Huntington Library. And I love the way you introduced Henry Huntington into this whole narrative. And it almost seemed like, well, I loved all the auctioning and the jockeying for position and all that. That was fascinating. And then it seemed like Arabella was at one of the parties and you kind of started with her, and then Henry shows up. It almost seemed like they were competing for a finite pot of rare documents. Is that really how it happened?
Yeah, with some of the Caxtons for sure. I mean, those were a huge prize for people who were interested in creating a full collection. There was one auction in particular, which we highlighted, and we used real people for that one. That was one that was very heavily covered by the press as well. And Belle, of course, was very, the light was shown upon her for her getting some of the Caxtons for a New York institution or for New York Library. But yeah, I think it was important to show the circles in which she was working. I mean, the Huntingtons were hugely powerful then. Arabella was a force herself, although it was the male members of her family who would most likely be at the auctions. And, there was a finite pot of key items, and I'm sure, again, Dr. Erickson would know better, but, some of these items, there might only be one or two in the world. That might be it. I mean, so if you, like Belle, were very interested in creating an academic collection that could compete with that was their goal, to really compete with some of the finest European institutions and collections. You had to round it out, right? You had to make sure you had the right Caxton and the right Gutenberg. You had to have those key players in the history of the printed word, because that's really in some ways what that early collection was. I mean, and of course it's grown into so many more things the Morgan Library has, but initially it was really a monument to the printed word. To get that one Caxton, you were going to go toe to toe with whoever, at least Belle was.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly that it was the Huntington that inspired me to pursue a career in rare books. My visits growing up as an adolescent to the Huntington Library. I'm from Los Angeles. And it's just an interesting, sort of turn of events that I end up at the Morgan, which is a dream job for me, having been inspired by the Huntington Library to pursue a career in rare books. So even beyond their death, their rivalry has inspired, entire careers.
And I loved the book. I thought it was fascinating. I wondered, this is a silly question, when and how was she outed? I mean, when did you find out about her? Or how did that, her passing
Become discovered. Yeah.
That's not a silly question. That's one we get all the time, right, Victoria? That's
Yeah. And so a lot more, because my focus is on the Chicago thing, but a lot more about what happened before his letters were discovered.
Yeah. So there was always speculation about Belle's identity. If you look, she was very famous during her lifetime. There were lots of profiles of her, social articles, whether it was a snippet in the social pages or a big profile in a magazine. And she would be referred to as like the exotic Belle DeCosta Green, the dusky complexion. So we know that those rumors were out there, and there's contemporary letters from the time period which would show that type of exchange. And we think, and this is Victorianized speculation, that maybe that was one of the reasons she wanted all of her letters destroyed, her personal letters, that maybe there was something in there that would have come out that she didn't want people to know. But the one thing that she could not have discovered was her connection with Richard T. Greener. Richard T. Greener was very well known during Belle's lifetime and in the decades after. He sort of faded in our lifetime, but he was well known. He was an advocate for equality with people like that we do know, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. And she could not allow people to discover that he was her father, because then, of course, her whole ruse would be discovered. So she was able to keep that from, the speculation continued, but the verification never happened during her lifetime. There was this is what I understand, there was a biography of Morgan in, I think it was 1980s or 90s, in which there was, whoever did the research, Jean Krause maybe, or Strauss, she found it was either a census document or a birth certificate in which Belle was listed as colored. And then when Heidi Artizzoni did her biography, she dove deep into the connection between Belle and Richard Greener and really mined that world. We did our own research as well, read several biographies. There's not a lot, there's maybe 3 scholarly biographies of Richard T. Greener, read several of his essays, some of which really stand the test of time, one in particular, The White Problem. But it wasn't really, when I first heard about Belle, that wasn't out there, that she was a Black woman passing. That really became better known as the years progressed, and it definitely confirmed with Heidi's biography.
Yeah, and Heidi's
Is that your understanding as well, Dr. Arison?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right.
What's your next projects? Is it individual solo projects, or is it going to be another co-author
we do
situation?
we do solo projects. And I have this historical fiction bug in me. That's what Marie does. But I don't, even with my solo projects, I don't take a move without Marie. So our second novel will be coming out next year. We just turned it in. You remember that deadline thing? It was a suggestion. We just turned it in, and I'm so excited about it. It's the story of the friendship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune. And a lot of people are not aware of Mary McLeod Bethune, who was probably the most powerful African-American in the late 20s, 30s, and 40s. She was the first Black woman in the presidential cabinet with FDR, but it's the friendship between these two women. In 1953, they appeared on the cover of Ebony magazine together, because Eleanor Roosevelt, it was very important to her that people saw that one of her best friends was a Negro. That was the word they used at that time. So they have some great conversations about race that we hope that people will be able to talk about. Marie and I talk about this book as being semi-autobiographical, because we talk the kind of conversations we have, but it's about these two women and the things that they accomplished that we have no idea that other people were given credit for. We're very excited about this book.
So excited. I mean,
So
they
next
are.
year, we have that to look forward to.
Next summer.
Next summer, okay, we'll keep an eye out. Do you have the title? Can somebody write it in the chat for us?
We wish.
Well, yeah, we had some titles. We had some names that we're not sure. I guess that's what we should just say. We're not sure yet.
We have some working titles that we should probably not divulge, but we will. We're in the process of discussing it right now.
We'll be looking forward to this.
Thanks.
I mean, bravo on what you've done individually and as a co-author writer team. It's difficult, but you guys have forged, I can tell, you're like one cell at this point.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I'd rather write with Marie than write alone.
Same. 100%. Feels very, all the conversations that we have, the sharing, it's just so much a part of the process. And when I'm off writing my own books, it feels very, very lonely. Very lonely.
I think we have another guest here who has a question or a comment to make.
Hello, good evening. I'm Danielle Rapu. I am a resident of Glendale, and I'm also an academic librarian who teaches library science courses. So I'm very excited to share this information with my students in the future. My question is about Belle. Her character was so witty. She had such finesse. And I feel like she really brought a lot of joy to me during a time that has been really difficult to navigate, and a time where I feel very burnt out as a librarian. So thank you for bringing that joy. And my question is, if there's any antidotes, any characteristics, something about Belle that had to be left out on the editing floor that you might share with us, anything that didn't make the book that you want to share.
Yeah, we had quite a few things that didn't make the book, only because, it couldn't be 700 pages, because she had that kind of life. But one of the things that we left on the floor that we had in the book was her nephew, Bobby, who was her sister Teddy's son. And Belle's mother ended up raising him. And we had it in there where a little bit, but we would have had to go off a little bit more on the story. So I was sad that we had to take him out of the book. Anything else, Marie, that you could think of that we cut out?
I mean, that was the hardest thing. I mean, one of the sacrifices that we highlighted in the book of passing for Belle, and we think for some of her siblings, was their decision and their inability to have their own families. Having a child could reveal their heritage. And so we kind of loved, Teddy was the youngest. None of the other siblings had children, as far as we can tell. Teddy was the fairest. She was blonde and blue-eyed, and she did have children. She did take that risk. And we kind of loved that Belle was able to have this opportunity to be a parent of her nephew, even though she wasn't able to have her own children. But again, it ultimately didn't work in the storyline, which was too bad. But yeah, that was probably the hardest thing to kind of, I mean, there were other things. Belle was like, she was a lady about town in a lot of different ways,
In a lot of different ways.
a lot of different. She had a very active love life. She had friendships with pretty much anyone you can think of. I mean, anyone, Sandra Bernhard, the actress, I mean, all sorts of people from that Gilded Age time period, not just the famous industrialists and financiers, but people in the art world, people in the writerly world. I mean, she really had her hand in so many different parts of that time period and in the cultural aspects of it. So there were lots of things we couldn't put in, but that the one about Bobby was the hardest.
Thank you so much for answering my question, and thanks for being here so late. I'm sure it's 3 hours ahead where you're all at. So thank you.
I will ask a quick question from the internet, from our chat. We've had quite a few questions. I think you've touched on most of them. One question, I was really intrigued by the relationship between Anne and Belle, both hiding big secrets with a lot to lose. How did you write that? What was the balance of speculation and history there?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I always tell people that as a biographical novel, there's a lot of truth in it. So we take the big beats of their life, but then we have to fill in the blanks, and we fill in the blanks with fiction. We connect the dots with fiction. So with Anne and Belle, we do know, right, Marie, that they did not like each other.
We do know there are some letters in which they talk about that there was Belle was very involved in the Morgan family life, almost like a family member. She would go to birthday parties and all sorts of stuff. Because don't forget, that library, that was his private library right next door to his house. It was like a separate part. It was like another room in his house. And so his children were in and out of there. And so she became really a big part of the family. But yeah, we do know that she was close with the other siblings, but she had some tension with Anne.
And we do know that Anne was gay. But we don't know why they had the tension. And so that was the fiction part, because we needed that tension. That's a good part about being a fiction writer. We said, okay, we need to throw somebody in here who's going to challenge her a little bit. And so that's how we did it. So that part was, but we did use a lot of the history and even the dialogue between them. If it were that way, those would have been the words.
The other thing about choosing to explore Anne's identity, and again, as Victoria said, we did use a lot of other people that were really her life. She was very good friends with Elsie de Wolfe, and that she was in a Boston marriage, and we knew those things to be the case from other research. But we don't know if Belle knew Anne's secret. I would presume that she did. I think it's kind of an open secret. But we chose to kind of explore Anne's identity because it was another opportunity to look at someone wearing a mask. Belle had to wear a mask throughout her entire life, especially in her years as the personal librarian to JP Morgan. And here was another opportunity to show somebody else from the Gilded Age wearing a mask, someone who couldn't be their authentic self, and how that was both a tension between them and something that they ultimately could share. So it was another way to kind of look at the dichotomy of that time period.
Do you think her story is unique, or do you think there are other untold stories of men and women who did extraordinary things, partly by passing?
I don't think it would be unique. I don't think it's a unique story. I think there are a lot of people whose life stories have been erased. I think a lot of women and a lot of Black people, they just kind of erased them from history. So I don't know of I couldn't give you a name off the top of my head, but I would be very surprised if her story was unique. I don't think it was.
Yeah. I mean, I think it certainly, she might have been one of the higher profile people to pass, but we don't really know that, you know. For example, in the co-written book we're writing right now, I'm thinking of Walter White, who was, I mean, you would have he was the head of the NAACP, hugely important in the civil rights movement. We meet him kind of early in his career. And, you know, he's somebody who could have passed easily, but chose to embrace his heritage and fight for equality, you know. So it can really go both ways. You know, you don't know how many people actually embrace their real heritage and how many people hit it, you know, depending on their circumstances.
Congratulations on a great book. It was a wonderful read, and thanks for being with us this evening. My name's Mary Mason. So I have two questions really. So after I read the book, of course, I had to search the internet for anything I could find on Belle. And she really does look Black to me. So it's my friend who recommended it, we were both kind of speculating, like, how does that happen that somebody was able to pass that way? That, I guess that's one question. And then did you want to put pictures in the book? Or how does that, did you think about it? Or I just wanted to know so much more about her after I read your story.
Yeah. We never talked about pictures because it's a novel. You know, it's not a biography. It's a novel. We made all that stuff, you know, a good part of that stuff up. But I want you to remember, because a lot of people look at her picture now and they say, wow, she looks Black. But remember that you're looking at her with 21st century eyes. And 100 years ago, we did not have the terms mixed and biracial. You were Black or you were white. There was a Southern term, mulatto, but you were Black or white, that's it, except for the people that started with the rumblings. So she could easily have passed 100 years ago, which she did.
Also, I mean, Victoria and I have talked a lot about people see what they want to see.
Yeah.
When you walk into the Morgan Library at that time and you saw this petite woman standing next to JP, and then on his arm at parties being introduced, you would assume that JP Morgan would not have a Black librarian, right? That would not be something you would think would be happening. And you would see a white woman. You know, should I tell the story about the painting? Yeah. So in JP Morgan's study at the Morgan, there's a painting that's behind his desk. I think it's called Portrait of a Man now, but at one point it was called Portrait of a Moor. It's from the 1600s or 1500s, at School of Tintoretto. And I have been at the Morgan many, many times before I even, you know, decided to write this book, you know, with Victoria. And I'd walk by that painting many times. There's many beautiful paintings there. And what I saw on the wall was, you know, another white man portrait. Or there's a lot of religious paintings there. And when the first time Victoria and I went there together, we were in that study and we were talking about the room and looking around. And all of a sudden I looked over and she was frozen before that painting. And I said, what's wrong? And she's like, why is there a Black man on JP Morgan's wall? And I looked at that painting, excuse me. And I looked at that painting really with fresh eyes, as if I'd never seen it before. And all of a sudden, I could see that it was a Black man, or a man of African descent of some variety, and that he looked an awful lot like Belle's father. So, you know, it was one of those moments when you realize that people see what they expect to see, whether or not that's actually what's right before their eyes. And I think that was very applicable to Belle and her situation.
Thank you. I look forward to visiting in 2024.
Yes.
Everybody should visit. Everybody here.
Everybody.
You haven't been there.
Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everyone, for your time this evening. If we could just give another round of applause to our wonderful presenters.